Welcome back everyone to another video. Today we're going to be summarizing the current situation of Donald Trump, the 2024 election, and how we got here. So without further ado, put on your goofy old little diver cap and let's dive right in. Alright, so I'll start with where we're at today. Basically, if you've been living under a rock, there's been election officials and courts within some states that have determined to remove Donald Trump from their primary ballot. The places that it has been affirmed as of now that Donald Trump has been disqualified from running on their state's presidential primary ballots include Colorado and Maine. Challenges to Donald Trump's eligibility for being on the presidential primary ballots are, as of now, still pending in Alaska, Nevada, New York, Oregon, South Carolina, Texas, Vermont, Wisconsin, and Wyoming. Challenges have been dismissed from judges or election officials, ruled against by judges, or voluntarily dismissed from the plaintiffs in Arizona, California, Florida, Michigan, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Utah, Virginia, and West Virginia. And now you might be saying, hey, does this even matter that states are disqualifying Trump from their primaries? Can't Donald Trump be written in even if he's not on the primary ballot? And the answer to that is, we're not sure. The Colorado Supreme Court ruled that write-ins for Donald Trump could not be counted within the state of Colorado. That's where we're at right now for the question of write-ins for someone who has been disqualified from a state's primary ballot. The Supreme Court has agreed to evaluate the case of whether or not the states are able to remove Donald Trump from their primary ballots. And now, at this point, you might be wondering, why are there some states that are even trying to remove Donald Trump from their presidential primary ballots? Well, Section 3 of our 14th Amendment says that, quote, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such disability, end quote. Which means that if Trump was complicit in insurrection or rebellion, he's not eligible to be president. Now, y'all might be like, whoa. Well, how the hell is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment enacted? Well, it doesn't explicitly require a criminal conviction, and you're seeing exactly how it's enacted now. The states invoke it themselves. And then, if it must, the case will work its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the court will have the final say in determining whether or not this move by some states is constitutional, which, as I've already stated, the Supreme Court has agreed to evaluate the case of whether or not the states are able to remove Donald Trump from their primary ballots. The rest of this video, we're going to talk about how we got into this position where former president and current jackass Donald Trump is being disqualified from presidential primary ballots within some of the states. For this video, we're going to focus on the federal election interference case and the Georgia election interference case, both against Donald Trump, and largely include the evidence that would make him constitutionally disqualified from being president. Those are 2 out of the 4 ongoing cases that Donald Trump is currently facing, with the other 2 being the hush money case and the classified documents case, which both are relevant to the claims that Donald Trump has engaged or aided in an insurrection or rebellion against the United States. Before we dive into the specific cases, I figured we might as well provide some brief legal background so that all of this can make a little more sense to us. The first piece of information that I want to provide to y'all to provide a little bit of legal background so that we can understand what's going on here is the U.S. Code is the official codification of the general and permanent federal statutes of the United States. The second piece of legal background information that I wanted to provide was the definition of conspire. The definition of conspire is to make plans to jointly commit an unlawful act. You're going to hear the word conspire a lot throughout this video. The third piece of legal background information I want to provide for y'all is the definition of solicit. To solicit means to ask for or try to obtain something from someone. That is another word that you're going to hear a lot throughout this video. The fourth piece of background legal information that I'm going to be providing is the definition of what an indictment is. An indictment is a formal accusation that someone has committed a crime, and that is another word that you're going to hear a lot throughout this video, and generally it will help you understand where we're currently at. Donald Trump has been indicted. That is where we're currently at in the process of all of these legal cases. Donald Trump has merely been indicted, which means that he has just been formally accused of committing certain crimes. The Fifth piece of legal background information that I'm going to be providing is the definition of a grand jury. A grand jury decides whether or not to bring an indictment to a potential defendant after having heard a prosecutor's case. Sixth and final background legal information that I'm going to be providing for y'all is the legal process for criminal cases, which may vary depending on the case, but from my understanding generally follows this structure. First, there's an investigation where investigators look into alleged crimes, obtain evidence, and help prosecutors understand the details of the case. Second is the charging. The prosecutor decides whether or not they want to present their case to a grand jury. The grand jury decides whether or not to indict the potential defendant. After that, there's a lot of stuff that happens in between, but we don't need to dwell on it. So third, the trial happens where the case is presented to a jury, and that jury will determine whether or not the defendant is guilty of the crimes they're being charged with. Then there's a little bit of stuff that happens that, again, we're not going to dwell on. So the fourth step is the sentencing, where if the defendant is found guilty, the judge will determine the sentence of their charges, where the maximum and minimum have already been established by Congress. After that is appeals, but again, we're not going to spend any time talking about that process because it's not relevant at this current moment. Cool, now we can start with the ongoing federal election interference case against Trump. This is a federal case, so the prosecutor, Jack Smith, is a United States attorney. More specifically, he is the special counsel for the United States Department of Justice. Smith presented a grand jury a case against Donald Trump, and the grand jury determined to indict Trump for 4 charges. Those charges are 2 felony counts of obstructing an official proceeding under Title 18, Section 1512 of U.S. Code, 1 felony count of conspiracy to defraud the United States under Title 18, Section 371 of U.S. Code, and 1 felony count of conspiracy against rights under Title 18, Section 241 of U.S. Code. Just hearing those charges in and of themselves is a bit confusing. It doesn't really mean much to any of us, which is why we're going to go into all of those 4 charges and what exactly Trump's being accused of quite a bit deeper. The first count of obstructing an official proceeding under Title 18, Section 1512 of U.S. Code is based on Donald Trump knowingly conspiring with co-conspirators to defraud the United States via dishonesty and fraud in order to obstruct the lawful federal government function by which the results of the presidential election are collected, counted, and certified by the federal government for the purpose of overthrowing the legitimate 2020 presidential election. There's like 6 nameless co-conspirators, but again, we're not going to focus on them, but just so you know, those people exist. Anywho, you're probably thinking lawful federal government function. That's kind of vague. Well, the indictment goes into more depth on that. And here's a summary of what it says. The United States federal government function being referred to is the way in which the results of the election for President of the United States are collected, counted, and certified, which was established through the Constitution and the Electoral Count Act of 1887. This means that electors select the president and that each state determines for itself how to appoint the electors apportioned to it. After Election Day, the ECA requires each state to formally determine the electors who would represent the state's voters by casting electoral votes on behalf of the candidate who had won the popular vote of the state, and required the executive of each state to certify to the federal government the identities of those electors. After that, those electors send their electoral votes to Congress along with their state executive certification that they were the state's legitimate electors. Finally, Congress meets in a joint session on January 6th for a certification process that is presided over by the Vice President as President of the Senate to count the electoral votes, resolve any objections, and announce the result, thus certifying the winner of the presidential election as President-elect. Now, y'all are probably like, okay, cool, but how did Donald Trump use dishonesty and fraud to obstruct that lawful federal government function, which the indictment provides 5 ways. First, Donald Trump, on the pretext of baseless election fraud claims, pushed officials in many states to ignore the popular vote, disenfranchise millions of voters, dismiss legitimate electors, and cause the ascertainment of and voting by illegitimate electors to vote for Donald Trump instead of adhering to their state's popular votes. Second, Donald Trump and co-conspirators organized fraudulent slates of electors in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, attempting to mimic the procedures that the legitimate electors were supposed to follow. This included causing the fraudulent electors to meet on the day appointed by the federal law on which legitimate electors were to gather and cast their fraudulent votes for Donald Trump and sign certificates falsely representing that they were legitimate electors. Donald Trump and co-conspirators then caused these fraudulent electors to transmit their false certificates to the vice president and other government officials to be counted at the certification proceeding on January 6th. Yeah, this was absolutely crazy. If none of y'all seen this, watch this clip real quick.
For the Capitol Commission, for the governor's office, for the Speaker of the House, for the Speaker of the Senate, the Capitol is closed unless you have an office here to conduct business today, or if you are taking part in the Electoral College process. Anybody else is not permitted to come in the Capitol.
They are here to...
The electors are already here. They've been checked in.
They're also electors.
Capitol's closed. All 16 electors that we've been advised by the governor's staff that we're going to be here to vote in the Electoral College have been checked in. They're already here.
But these are the rest of the electors.
I understand. But the Capitol is closed. Everybody else permitted.
Captain, the electors are also, the GOP electors are also on the governor's certificate of ascertainment.
I'm not going to get into a political debate. I'm following orders.
It's not a political debate.
Okay.
It's the official sealed document. The certificate of ascertainment has also the GOP electors. They are here. They're trying to do their constitutional duty.
I understand.
And their constitutional duty requires them to be at the Senate chamber today at 2 p.m.
Okay.
They're here.
All right, they're not. I understand they're not being permitted in. If you have a problem, you can contact the governor's office, the Speaker of the House, the Senate Majority Leader, or
I saw the governor's press release this morning. It said due to COVID. Is that the reason being given?
No.
All right, that was what the press release said. Is there another reason why?
You'd have to ask the governor's office to answer that question. I don't have.
We have a copy of paperwork that was prepared as electors under their constitutional duty. Can I speak to the Sergeant of Arms of the Senate to deliver it to the chamber today?
He's in a meeting right now with the Electoral College. He's not available to meet.
Captain Green, is it Captain?
First Lieutenant Green.
First Lieutenant, can you deliver this?
I cannot.
Okay. Is there anyone here that's willing to allow us, I've got elected officials and electors, to deliver this to the Senate today at 2 p.m.
Okay. I can ask the Senate Majority Leader, the House Majority Leader, and
Senator Mike Shirkey, would you deliver that to him? Tell him Ian Northen.
You can contact his office directly and make arrangements to drop that off to him, sir. I'm not going to take anything.
You're not letting us in the building. His office is inside.
He's not here.
What's that?
He's not here.
So are you telling me that the Senate chamber is in session and the Senate leader's not here?
Yeah. So you'd have to contact his office and make arrangements to meet with him to turn over.
Somebody from the governor's team that's running this.
You'd have to contact the governor's office with their team to make arrangements for them.
All right. Again, the electors by statute, it's statute MCL 168.47, have to be at the Senate chamber today.
Okay.
At 2 p.m. They're trying.
I'm telling you that they're not going to be allowed to enter the Capitol, sir.
All right. Thank you, Lieutenant.
You're welcome. Thank you.
What was your hope and plan today by coming here?
The electors can speak for themselves, but the hope and plan is for them to follow their constitutional duty. Under the U.S. Constitution, not just the Michigan Constitution, but under the U.S. Constitution, the electors have a duty to vote for their chosen candidate. In this case, the GOP electors slate their chosen candidate, President Trump. The Democrat electors are inside, I'm told, slating their chosen candidate, Joseph Biden. There's actually Green Party and Libertarian Party electors selected before the election as well. So the statute says it has to be done at 2 p.m. That's why they're here trying to do it. That paperwork is signed, it's sealed, and it's trying to be delivered.
Third, Donald Trump and co-conspirators attempted to use the power and authority of the Justice Department to conduct sham election crime investigations and to send a letter to the targeted states that falsely claimed that the Justice Department had identified significant concerns that may have impacted the election outcome in order for Donald Trump's false elector plan to be advanced by presenting the fraudulent electors as a valid alternative to the legitimate electors. Fourth, Donald Trump and co-conspirators attempted to enlist the vice president to use his ceremonial role at the January 6th certification proceeding to fraudulently alter the election results. First, by using knowingly false claims of election fraud to convince Mike Pence to use the fraudulent electors, reject the legitimate electoral votes, or send legitimate electoral votes to state legislatures for review rather than counting them. After that failed on the morning of January 6th, Donald Trump and co-conspirators knowingly repeated false claims of election fraud to gather supporters, falsely told them that Mike Pence had the authority to and might alter the election results, and then directed them to the Capitol to obstruct the certification proceeding and exert pressure on Mike Pence to take the fraudulent actions that he had previously refused. Alright, that was the first charge against Donald Trump in the federal election interference case. The second charge against Donald Trump is for conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding under Title 18, Section 1512 of U.S. Code. and basically says that Donald Trump knowingly conspired with co-conspirators to corruptly obstruct and impede the official proceeding of the certification of the electoral vote. The third charge against Donald Trump is for obstruction of and an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding under Title 18, Section 1512 of U.S. Code, attempted to and did corruptly obstruct the certification of the electoral vote. And the fourth and final charge against Donald Trump in this case is that he knowingly conspired with co-conspirators to intimidate or threaten one or more people in the free exercise and enjoyment of a right secured to them by the Constitution and laws of the United States, that being the right to vote and have one's vote counted. An interesting thing about this case is that since it is a federal case and since the pardoning power is vested in the president by Article 2, Section 2 of the first clause in the United States Constitution, that means if Donald Trump were to become president again, he'd theoretically be able to pardon himself, but that's not 100% set in stone, and if it were to happen, then we would have to see that legally play out. TLDR for the federal interference case against Trump, there's 4 charges. The first charge against Donald Trump and co-conspirators is that they obstructed an official proceeding by being dishonest and acting fraudulently, which they did in multiple ways in order to overturn the legitimate results of the 2020 election. The second charge against Donald Trump and co-conspirators is that they conspired to obstruct the official proceeding of the certification of the electoral vote. The third charge against Donald Trump and co-conspirators is that they attempted to and did corruptly obstruct the certification of the electoral votes. And the fourth charge is that Donald Trump and co-conspirators conspired to threaten people's free exercise of their rights secured to them by having their vote not be counted. If y'all thought that that was a lot, I am sorry, my brothers in Christ, you better buckle up because now we're about to talk about the Georgia election interference case. This is not a federal case. Fani Willis, the district attorney of Fulton County in Georgia, opened up the investigation and is the prosecutor in this case. Since this is not a federal case, unlike the previous case we spoke of, even if Donald Trump won the presidency, he could not pardon himself from this. Only Georgia State Board of Pardons and Parole has the authority to grant a pardon to Donald Trump, which they likely wouldn't do as the board is appointed by the governor, Brian Kemp, who's a Republican, but as we can see with the released Georgia phone call and the whole way that the Georgia election played out, he was unwilling to give in to the pressure from Donald Trump and his co-conspirators.
So what are we going to do here, folks? I only need 11,000 votes. Fellas, I need 11,000 votes. Give me a break.
There are 19 named defendants in this Georgia election interference case, with a total of 41 state law felony charges being levied at them. 13 of those charges are made against Donald Trump, and those being 1 count of violating the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, 3 counts of solicitation of violation of oath by a public officer, 1 count of conspiracy to commit impersonating a public officer, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit forgery in the first degree, 2 counts of false statements in writings, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit false statements in writings, 1 count of filing false documents, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit filing false documents. Alright, so with this case, let's start with the RICO charge. This charge is against Donald Trump and the 18 other defendants that you can see all listed right there, with the most notable names being Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, Mark Meadows, and Sidney Powell. They're all being accused of violating the Georgia RICO Act, known as Georgia Code Section 1614-4, which says, quote, A. It shall be unlawful for any person through a direct pattern of racketeering activity or proceeds derived therefrom to acquire or maintain directly or indirectly any interest in or control of any enterprise, real property, or personal property of any nature, including money. B. It shall be unlawful for any person employed by or associated with any enterprise to conduct or participate in, directly or indirectly, such enterprise through a pattern of racketeering activity. C. It shall be unlawful for any person to conspire or endeavor to violate any of the provisions of subsection A or B of this code section. A person violates this subsection when 1. He or she, together with 1 or more persons, conspires to violate any of the provisions of subsection A or B of this code section, and any 1 or more of such persons commits any overt act to affect the object of the conspiracy, or 2. He or she endeavors to violate any of the provisions of subsection A or B of this code section and commits any overt act to affect the object of the endeavor. End quote. I need a water break, and not that kind of water break. Much better. Okay, so specifically, this RICO charge says that the 19 defendants, which includes Donald Trump, violated Section C of this code by unlawfully conspiring while associated with an enterprise to directly or indirectly engage in a pattern of racketeering activity that is in violation of Section B of this code. That's all pretty complicated, but basically Donald Trump lost the state of Georgia in the 2020 election against Joe Biden, and Trump with other co-conspirators knowingly and willfully joined a conspiracy to unlawfully change the outcome of the election in favor of Donald Trump. The conspirators held a common plan and purpose to commit multiple acts of racketeering in Georgia and other states. Further, to clarify about the enterprise that is being referred to in this indictment, Georgia Code Section 1614.3 defines an enterprise as, quote, a group of individuals associated in fact, end quote, meaning that Trump, all the other defendants, and some more unnamed people, when acting as a criminal organization, planning, participating, and conspiring for the same criminal goals, they acted as an enterprise. There's a total of 161 acts in the indictment that are levied against a plurality of combinations of the different defendants, but for the sake of this video, we aren't going to focus on any of the actions made by other defendants on behalf of Donald Trump or furthering the goals of the conspiracy. We're just going to focus on the acts that are being used to levy this charge against Donald Trump, which brings us down to 43. Oh God, what the hell did we sign up for? The first act provided in the indictment as evidence that Donald Trump conspired to / did engage in criminal racketeering activity in Georgia and other states is Act 1. On November 4th of 2020, Donald Trump made a nationally televised speech falsely declaring victory of the 2020 election.
It's also clear that we have won Georgia. We're up by 2.5%. We're 117,000 votes with only 7% left. They're never going to catch us. They can't catch us. And all of a sudden, everything just stopped. This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
The next act is Act 5, which says that Donald Trump and Mark Meadows met with Majority Leader of the Michigan Senate, Michael Shirkey, Speaker of the Michigan House of Representatives, Lee Chatfield, and other Michigan legislators in the Oval Office at the White House, and Donald Trump made false statements concerning fraud in the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election in Michigan. Act 7, on November 22nd of 2020, Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani placed a call to Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives, Russell Bowers. During the call, Giuliani made false claims about the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election in Arizona and solicited, requested, and importuned Bowers to unlawfully appoint presidential electors from Arizona. Act 8. On November 25th of 2020, Rudy Giuliani and Jenna Ellis appeared, spoke, and presented witnesses at a meeting with Pennsylvania legislators in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. During the meeting, Giuliani made false statements concerning fraud in the 2020 presidential election in Pennsylvania and solicited, requested, and importuned the Pennsylvania legislators present at the meeting to unlawfully appoint presidential electors from Pennsylvania. Trump joined the meeting via phone and made false statements concerning fraud in the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election in Pennsylvania, as well as solicited, requested, and importuned the Pennsylvania legislators at the meeting to unlawfully appoint presidential electors from Pennsylvania. Act 9. Right after that meeting in Pennsylvania I just mentioned, Trump invited a group of the Pennsylvania legislators and others to meet with him at the White House. Later that day, Trump and co-conspirators met with the Pennsylvania legislators at the White House and discussed holding a special session of the Pennsylvania General Assembly. Act 14. On November 27th of 2020, Donald Trump placed a phone call to President pro tempore of the Pennsylvania Senate, Jake Corbin, for the purpose of soliciting, requesting, and importuning Corbin to unlawfully appoint presidential electors from Pennsylvania. Act 17. On November 30th of 2020, Rudy Giuliani and Jenna Ellis appeared, spoke, and presented witnesses at a meeting of Arizona legislators in Phoenix, Arizona. Donald Trump joined the meeting via phone and made false statements concerning fraud in the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election in Arizona. Act 19. In December of 2020, Donald Trump and Mark Meadows met with John McKenty and requested that McKenty prepare a memorandum outlining a strategy for disrupting and delaying the joint session of Congress on January 6, 2021, the day prescribed by law for counting votes cast by the duly elected and qualified presidential electors from Georgia and the other states. The strategy included having Mike Pence count only half of the electoral votes from certain states and then return the remaining electoral votes to state legislatures. Act 22. On December 3rd of 2020, Donald Trump caused to be tweeted from his Twitter that, quote, Georgia hearings now on at OANN. Amazing. Act 26. On December 3rd of 2020, Donald Trump caused to be tweeted from his Twitter that, quote,
Wow, blockbuster testimony taking place right now in Georgia. Ballot stuffing by Dems when Republicans were forced to leave the large counting room. Plenty more coming, but this alone leads to an easy win of the state.
Act 27. On December 3rd of 2020, Donald Trump caused to be tweeted from his Twitter that, quote,
people in Georgia got caught cold bringing in massive numbers of ballots and putting them in voting machines. Great job at Brian Kemp.
End quote. Act 28. On December 3rd of 2020, Donald Trump met with Speaker of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives Brian Cutler in the Oval Office at the White House and discussed holding a special session of the Pennsylvania General Assembly. Act 30. On December 3rd and December 26th of 2020, Donald Trump placed phone calls to President pro tempore of the Georgia Senate Butch Miller. Act 31. On December 5th, 2020, Donald Trump placed a call to Georgia Governor Brian Kemp and requested and importuned Kemp to call a special session of the Georgia General Assembly. Act 32. On December 6, 2020, Donald Trump caused to be tweeted from his Twitter that, quote,
gee, what a surprise. Has anyone informed the so-called, says he has no power to do anything, governor, at Brian Kemp and his puppet lieutenant governor, at Jeff Duncan, that they could have easily solved this mess and win, signature verification, and call a special session. So easy!
Act 40. On December 7th of 2020, Donald Trump requested that Bill White, an individual associated with the Trump campaign, then residing in Fulton County, Georgia, provide him with certain information, including contact information for Majority Leader of the Georgia Senate Mike Dugan and President pro tempore of the Georgia Senate Butch Miller. The following day, White provided the requested information to Rudy Giuliani via email. Act 42. On December 7th of 2020, Donald Trump committed the felony offense of solicitation of violation of oath by public officer in Georgia Code Section 1647 and 1610.1 in Fulton County, Georgia, by unlawfully soliciting, requesting, and importuning Speaker of the Georgia House of Representatives David Ralston, a public officer, to engage in conduct constituting the felony offense of violation of oath by public officer in Georgia Code Section 1610.1 by calling for a special session of the Georgia General Assembly for the purpose of unlawfully appointing presidential electors from Georgia in willful and intentional violation of the terms of the oath of said person as prescribed by law, with intent that said person engage in said conduct. Act 43. On December 8th of 2020, Donald Trump called Georgia Attorney General Chris Carr for the purpose of making false statements concerning fraud in the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election in Georgia and elsewhere. During the call, Trump asked Carr not to discourage other state attorney generals from joining a federal lawsuit filed by the state of Texas contesting the administration of the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election in Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Act 44. On December 8th of 2020, Donald Trump and John Eastman called Republican National Committee Chairwoman Ronna McDaniel to request her assistance gathering certain individuals to meet and cast electoral votes for Donald Trump on December 14th of 2020 in certain states, despite the fact that Donald Trump lost the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election in those states. Act 75. December 14th of 2020, Trump caused to be tweeted from his Twitter, quote,
what a fool Governor at Brian Kemp of Georgia is. Could have been so easy, but now we have to do it the hard way. Demand this clown call a special session and open up signature verification now. Otherwise, it could be a bad day for two great senators on January 5th. End quote.
Act 90. December 18th of 2020, Donald Trump, Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, and others met at the White House. The people present at the meeting discussed certain strategies and theories intended to influence the outcome of the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election, including seizing voting equipment and appointing Sidney Powell as special counsel with broad authority to investigate allegations of voter fraud in Georgia and elsewhere. Act 93. December 23rd of 2020, Donald Trump called the office of the Georgia Secretary of State Chief Investigator Francis Watson that had been previously arranged by Mark Meadows. During the call, Trump falsely states that he had won the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election in Georgia, quote,
by hundreds of thousands of votes,
end quote, and stated to Watson that, quote,
when the right answer comes out, you'll be praised,
end quote. Act 95. December 25th of 2020, Donald Trump called Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives, Russell Bowers, for the purpose of soliciting, requesting, and importuning Bowers to unlawfully appoint presidential electors from Arizona. Act 97. December 27th of 2020, Donald Trump solicited acting United States Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen and acting United States Deputy Attorney General Richard Donahue to make a false statement by stating, quote,
Just say that the election was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressmen.
End quote. Act 100. December 30th of 2020, Donald Trump caused to be tweeted from his Twitter that, quote,
hearings from Atlanta on the Georgia election overturned now being broadcast. Check it out at OANN, at Newsmax, and many more. At Brian Kemp should resign from office. He is an obstructionist who refuses to admit that we won Georgia big. Also won the other swing states.
End quote. Act 101. December 30th of 2020, Donald Trump caused to be tweeted from his Twitter that, quote,
hearings from Atlanta on the Georgia election overturned now being broadcast live via at RSB Network.
End quote. Act 106. December 30th of 2020, Donald Trump caused to be tweeted from his Twitter that, quote,
we now have far more votes than needed to flip Georgia in the presidential race. Massive voter fraud took place. Thank you to the Georgia legislature for today's revealing meeting.
End quote. Act 108. December 31st of 2020, Donald Trump and Charles Eastman committed the felony offense of filing false documents in violation of Georgia Code Section 161020.1 in Fulton County, Georgia, by knowingly filing a document titled Verified Complaint for Emergency Injunctive and Declaratory Relief in the matter of the case of Trump v. Kemp. Earlier on the same day, John Eastman sent an email to attorneys associated with the Trump campaign, admitting his knowledge that at least some of the allegations in the verified complaint were not accurate, meaning that this filing was also an act of racketeering activity under Georgia Code Section 1614.3. Act 112. January 2nd of 2021, Donald Trump and Mark Meadows committed the felony offense of solicitation of violation of oath by public officer in violation of Georgia Code Section 1647 and 1610.1 in Fulton County, Georgia, by unlawfully soliciting, requesting, and importuning Georgia's Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, a public officer, to engage in conduct constituting the felony offense of violation of oath by public officer, Georgia Code Section 1610.1, by unlawfully altering, unlawfully adjusting, and otherwise unlawfully influencing the certified returns for presidential electors for the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election in Georgia, and willful and intentional violation of the terms of the oath of said person as prescribed by law, with intent that said person engage in said conduct. Act 113. January 2nd of 2021, Donald Trump committed the felony offense of false statements and writings in violation of Georgia Code Section 1610.20 in Fulton County, Georgia, by knowingly, willfully, and unlawfully making at least one false statement in representation to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, Georgia Deputy Secretary of State Jordan Fuchs, and Georgia Secretary of State General Counsel Ryan Germany. Fuchs would be such a dope name to have, like, oh, that motherfucker Fuchs, like, ooh, yeah, hell yeah, fuck yeah, yeah. Alright, anyways. Act 114. January 3rd of 2021, Donald Trump caused to be tweeted from his Twitter, quote,
I spoke to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger yesterday about Fulton County and voter fraud in Georgia. He was unwilling or unable to answer questions such as the ballots under table scam, ballot destruction, out-of-state voters, dead voters, and more. He has no clue.
End quote. Act 123. January 4th of 2021, Donald Trump and John Eastman met with Vice President Mike Pence, Chief of Staff to the Vice President Mark Short, and Counsel to the Vice President Greg Jacob in the Oval Office at the White House. During the meeting, Trump and Eastman argued to Pence that he could either reject electoral votes from certain states or delay the joint session of Congress on January 6th of 2021. The day prescribed by law for counting votes cast by the duly elected and qualified presidential electors from Georgia and other states for the purpose of allowing certain state legislatures to unlawfully appoint presidential electors in favor of Trump. During the meeting, John Eastman admitted both options violated the Electoral Count Act. Act 128. January 5th of 2021, Donald Trump caused to be tweeted from his Twitter that, quote,
the vice president has the power to reject fraudulently chosen electors.
End quote. Act 130. January 5th of 2021, Donald Trump met with Mike Pence in the Oval Office at the White House. During the meeting, Trump stated Pence had the power to decertify the November 3rd presidential election results, that people cheat, and that Pence wanted to, quote,
play by Marquez of Queensberry rules.
End quote. When Pence stated that it was his duty to support and defend the Constitution, that only Congress had the power to decide to reject slates of presidential electors, Trump stated that Pence was naive, implied that he lacked courage, and stated that Pence was doing a, quote,
great disservice.
End quote. Act 131. January 5th of 2021, Donald Trump called Mike Pence, During the call, Trump and John Eastman attempted to persuade Pence to reject slates of presidential electors or return the slates of presidential electors to state legislatures. Act 132. January 5th of 2021, Trump placed a second call to Pence. During the call, Trump asked Pence if he had received a copy of a letter from a group of Pennsylvania legislators urging Congress to return the state's electoral college votes, and states to Pence, quote, "You gotta be tough tomorrow," end quote. Act 133. January 5th of 2021, Donald Trump issued a statement through the Trump campaign that falsely stated that, quote, "The Vice President and I are in total agreement that the Vice President has the power to act. Our Vice President has several options under the U.S. Constitution. He can decertify the results or send them back to the states for change in certification. He can also decertify the illegal and corrupt results and send them to the House of Representatives for the one vote for one state tabulation." End quote. Act 135. January 6th of 2021, Donald Trump appeared and spoke at a rally at the Ellipse in Washington, D.C. During the rally, Trump made false statements concerning fraud in the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election in Georgia and elsewhere, solicited Mike Pence to disrupt and delay the joint session of Congress on January 6th of 2021, the date prescribed by law for counting votes cast by the duly elected and qualified presidential electors from Georgia and other states, and encouraged those in attendance at the rally to march to the United States Capitol.
Now it is up to Congress to confront this egregious assault on our democracy. And after this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here, we're going to walk down to the Capitol. And we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women. And we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them, because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong.
Act 138. January 6th of 2021, Donald Trump caused to be tweeted from his Twitter that, quote, "If Vice President Mike Pence comes through for us, we will win the presidency. Many states want to decertify the mistake they made in certifying incorrect and even fraudulent numbers in a process not approved by their state legislatures, which it must be. Mike can send it back." End quote. Act 139. January 6th of 2021, Donald Trump caused to be tweeted from his Twitter that, quote, "States went to correct their votes, which they know were based on irregularities and fraud, plus corrupt process never received legislative approval. All Mike Pence has to do is send them back to the states, and we win. Do it, Mike. This is a time for extreme courage." End quote. Act 140. January 6th of 2021, Donald Trump placed a call to Mike Pence and solicited him to disrupt and delay the joint session of Congress on January 6th of 2021, the day prescribed by law for counting votes cast by the duly elected and qualified presidential electors from Georgia and other states. When Pence refused, Trump stated that Pence would, quote, "go down as a wimp," end quote, and that Pence was not protecting the United States. Act 156. On September 17th of 2021, Donald Trump committed the felony offense of solicitation of violation of oath by public officer in violation of Georgia Code Section 1647 and 1610(1) in Fulton County, Georgia, by unlawfully soliciting, requesting, and importuning Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, a public officer, to engage in conduct by constituting the felony offense of violation of oath by public officer, Georgia Code Section 1610(1), by unlawfully, quote, "decertifying the election or whatever the correct legal remedy is and announce the true winner," end quote. In willful and intentional violation of the terms of the oath of said person as prescribed by law with intent that said person engage in said conduct. Act 157. September 17th of 2021, Donald Trump committed the felony offense of false statements and writings in violation of Georgia Code Section 1610(20) in Fulton County, Georgia, by knowingly, willfully, and unlawfully making the following false statement and representation to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger. Quote, "As stated to you previously, the number of false and/or irregular votes is far greater than needed to change the Georgia election result." End quote. This was an act of racketeering activity under Georgia Code Section 1614(3). More water! Alright, we're done with the first charge in the Georgia election interference case. On to the second charge from this case levied against Donald Trump is solicitation of violation of oath by public officer in violation of Georgia Code Section 1647 and 1610(1), accusing Trump of, on December 7th of 2020, having unlawfully solicited, requested, and importuned Speaker of the Georgia House of Representatives David Ralston, a public officer, to engage in conduct constituting the felony offense of violation of oath by public officer in violation of Georgia Code Section 1610(1) by calling for a special session of the Georgia General Assembly for the purpose of unlawfully appointing presidential electors from the state of Georgia in willful and intentional violation of the terms of the oath of said person as prescribed by law, with intent that said person engage in said conduct, contrary to the laws of said state, the good order, peace, and dignity thereof. The third charge against Trump in this case is that he and co-conspirators conspired to commit impersonating a public officer in violation of Georgia Code Section 1648 and 1610(23) by unlawfully conspiring to cause certain individuals to falsely hold themselves out as the duly elected and qualified presidential electors from the state of Georgia, public officers, with intent to mislead the President of the United States Senate, the Archivist of the United States, the Georgia Secretary of State, and the Chief Judge of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia into believing that they actually were such officers. The fourth charge against Trump in this case is that he and co-conspirators conspired to commit forgery in the first degree in violation of Georgia Code Section 1648 and 1691 by having unlawfully conspired with the intent to defraud by knowingly making a document titled, quote,
Certificate of the Votes of the 2020 Electors from Georgia,
end quote, in such a manner that the writing, as made, purports to have been made by the authority of the duly elected and qualified presidential electors from the state of Georgia, who did not give such authority, and to utter and deliver said document to the Archivist of the United States. The fifth charge against Trump in this case is that he and co-conspirators conspired to commit false statements and writings in violation of Georgia Code Section 1648 and 1610(20) by unlawfully conspiring to knowingly and willfully make and use a false document titled, quote,
Certificate of the Votes of the 2020 Electors from Georgia,
end quote, with knowledge that said document contained the false statement, quote, we, the undersigned, being the duly elected and qualified electors for President and Vice President of the United States of America from the state of Georgia, do hereby certify the following, end quote. The sixth charge against Trump in this case is that he and co-conspirators conspired to commit filing false documents in violation of Georgia Code Section 1648 and 1610(20.1 by unlawfully conspiring to knowingly file, enter, and record a document titled, quote,
Certificate of the Votes of the 2020 Electors from Georgia,
end quote, in a court of the United States, having reason to know that said document contained materially false statement, quote, we, the undersigned, being the duly elected and qualified electors for President and Vice President of the United States of America from the state of Georgia, do hereby certify the following, end quote. The seventh charge against Trump in this case is that he and co-conspirators conspired to commit forgery in the first degree, violating Georgia Code Section 1648 and 1691 by unlawfully conspiring with the intent to defraud by knowingly making a document titled, quote,
Notice of Filling of Electoral College Vacancy,
end quote, in such manner that the writing as made purports to have been made by the authority of the duly elected and qualified presidential electors from the state of Georgia who did not give such authority, and to utter and deliver said document to the Archivist of the United States and the office of the Governor of Georgia. The eighth charge against Trump in this case is that he and co-conspirators unlawfully conspired to knowingly and willfully make and use a false document titled, quote,
Notice of Filling of Electoral College Vacancy,
end quote, with knowledge that said document contained the false statements that David Schaefer was chairman of the 2020 Georgia Electoral College meeting and Sean Still was secretary of the 2020 Georgia Electoral College meeting. The ninth charge against Trump in this case is that he and John Eastman filed false documents violating Georgia Code Section 1610(20.1 by having knowingly and unlawfully filed a document titled, quote,
Verified Complaint for Emergency, Injunctive, and Declaratory Relief,
end quote, in the matter of Trump v. Kemp case. In the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia, a court of the United States having reason to know that said document contained at least one materially false statement. The 10th charge against Trump in this case is that he and Mark Meadows solicited violation of oath by public officer in violation of Georgia Code Section 1647 and 1610(1 by having unlawfully solicited, requested, and importuned Georgia's Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, a public officer, to engage in conduct constituting the felony offense of violation of oath by public officer in violation of Georgia Code Section 1610(1) by unlawfully altering, adjusting, and influencing the certified returns for presidential electors for the November 3, 2020 presidential election in Georgia, in willful and intentional violation of the terms of the oath of said person as prescribed by law, with intent that said person engage in said conduct, contrary to the laws of said state, the good order, peace, and dignity thereof. The 11th charge against Trump in this case is that he made false statements and writings in violation of Georgia Code Section 1610(20) by knowingly, willfully, and unlawfully making at least one false statement and representation to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, Georgia Deputy Secretary of State Jordan Fox, and Georgia Secretary of State General Counsel Ryan Germany. The 12th charge against Trump in this case is that he solicited violation of oath by public officer in violation of Georgia Code Section 1647 and 1610(1) by having unlawfully solicited, requested, and importuned Georgia's Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, a public officer, to engage in conduct that constituted the felony offense of violation of oath by public officer in violation of Georgia Code Section 1610(1) by unlawfully, quote,
decertifying the election or whatever the correct legal remedy is and announce the true winner,
end quote, in willful and intentional violation of the terms of the oath of said person as prescribed by law, with intent that said person engage in said conduct. 13th and final charge against Trump in this case is that he made false statements and writings in violation of Georgia Code Section 1610(20) by knowingly, willfully, and unlawfully saying to the Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, quote,
as stated to you previously, the number of false and or irregular votes is far greater than needed to change the Georgia election result,
end quote. Last water break. Now that we've gone over all the charges levied at Donald Trump in first, the federal election interference case, and secondly, the Georgia election interference case, we may think to ourselves, why in the world did Donald Trump and his co-conspirators plan and take all of these absurd steps and actions? And there's multiple different reasons as to why Trump and his co-conspirators planned and acted the way they did, but largely all of it is grounded in Eastman's legal theory. John Eastman was a lawyer for Donald Trump who advanced the legal theory that the United States Vice President has a unilateral authority to reject certified state electors. Eastman argued that this was the case because the Electoral Count Act of 1887 was unconstitutional. The Electoral Count Act of 1887 is a United States law that added procedures for the counting of electoral votes following a presidential election, with the purpose of the act being to minimize congressional involvement in election disputes, which instead placed the primary responsibility to resolve disputes upon the states and clarified the vice president's limited role in the electoral vote count. For example, the act clarified that both houses could overrule the vice president's decision to include or exclude votes, and under the act, even if the chambers disagree, the governor's certification, not the vice president's, broke the tie. Eastman argued that this was unconstitutional because this was a violation of the 12th Amendment, which prescribes that the Vice President, as President of the Senate, opens the electoral certificates and finalizes the election results. Eastman asserted that coming from the 12th Amendment means that the Vice President does all the counting of electoral votes and resolves any disputed electoral votes, whereas the members of Congress can just watch. Eastman refers to the actions of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams in the 1796 and 1800 elections as proof of this claim. This legal theory hasn't really been tested out, but it's obviously not true, as we can see that a core principle of the United States Constitution, law, and governance is checks and balances. So it obviously is not the intent of any legal writings that we allow for the vice president to single-handedly resolve or determine how to resolve electoral disputes, and we've seen numerous instances historically where vice presidents finalize the legitimate results of a presidential election where their party or even they lost. Hence threw the largest wrench at this theory by rejecting it and recognizing his position for finalizing the presidential electoral votes as mostly ceremonial. Trump and his co-conspirators attempted to send a large, very angry, and fairly violent crowd to the Capitol as an attempt to further obstruct and delay the official proceeding of the certification of the electoral votes, in which they could have more time in trying to have Pence resolve the electoral disputes that Trump and his co-conspirators alleged existed, which the states did not find in their certification process or investigations. Or another option is they wanted Pence to send the electoral disputes to be resolved by the state legislatures, in which Trump and his co-conspirators would have another chance of trying to have the election ruled in his favor.
They've got the gallows set outside this Capitol building. It's time to start fucking using them.
Start making a list, put all those names down, and we start hunting them down one by one.
Traitors get guillotined.
Mobilize in your own cities, your own counties, storm your own Capitol buildings, and take down every one of these corrupt motherfuckers.
That was a lot for this video, but here's the TLDR. Trump and his co-conspirators are accused of acting fraudulently and dishonestly in order to perpetuate the conspiracy of overturning the legitimate results of the 2020 federal presidential election, as well as overturning the legitimate results of many of the states' 2020 presidential election. Because of this, states are determining whether or not Trump is allowed on their 2024 presidential primary ballot, since it appears he may have engaged in attempting or aiding an insurrection by trying to unlawfully overturn the outcomes of those legitimate elections. The Supreme Court has agreed to hear a case over this, but it seems to me that this is up for the states to invoke, and there's no requirement of a criminal conviction for the states to invoke Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, so I don't see much legal grounding for the Supreme Court to be able to strike this down. The last note is that if Trump wins presidency in 2024, he can pardon himself from the federal election interference case, but he cannot pardon himself from the Georgia election interference case, as it is not a federal case. If you made it this far in the video, I wanted to let y'all know that I made a Patreon, so if you're able to support my content creating endeavors, I'd very much so appreciate it. If you can't or don't want to, I still love and appreciate you, and you should join the Discord. The invite's right there on the screen and the pinned comment. Anyway, that's it for this video. Peace.